very warm welcome to a new episode of MELT. I'm Ritvika Gupta, shooting from home. Continuing our series of sessions from ZeeMELT 2021, we'll be showcasing a talk by Mark Adams, Senior Vice President and Head of Innovation, Vice Media. Mark is an award-winning global thought leader on content strategy and has worked with top celebrities and companies to lead content and digital transformation. His session titled The 5 Immutable Laws of Innovation will bring us through 5 principles that have unlocked the greatest innovations of the past, the present, and the future. Let's get ready to melt with Mark Adams.
A little bit of background about me. I was really lucky to be at the right place at the right time, just as, Web 2.0 was kind of happening. And I was at university. I was a very geeky little kid building websites and all this kind of stuff. And I realized that celebrities didn't have very good digital, right? So, that makes sense. They're very busy people. So I started to, because I'm a wannabe DJ, or a failed DJ now because I'm older, but I was a wannabe DJ then. I started going to all these celebrities and saying, look, especially musicians, I said, look, would you be willing to play my kind of student night thing that I was running? And in return, I don't have any money, but I will look after your digital. And most of them told me to get lost. And then finally, Lady Gaga on the left-hand side said yes. And so I had this crazy situation where I was starting to look after Lady Gaga's platforms, building her websites, then eventually building her social media when that started to become a thing. Started building a team around that. Very, very quickly, we had lots of people working for us. And interestingly, we pitched the same idea to Madonna, and Madonna wasn't interested. And it showed me a lot about market share in business, that Madonna was too slow to put the flag in the ground of her own brand in the new Web 2.0 world. And as a result, Lady Gaga basically stole her place in culture. And so the reason I want to tell you that is, it's a bit of a background to me, but more importantly, I think it's a really interesting story about the power of culture, some of the stuff I'm about to talk about, and how that leads to actual business success or failure. And it's quite an interesting thing that Madonna managed to reinvent her brand in multiple generations, but then she just stopped. And meanwhile, Lady Gaga kind of stole her identity, really. So as I was mentioning, 7 years ago, Vice was not in a really good place. I'll talk more about that in a bit. And we realized we weren't the only ones, right? When we started digging into this, we realized that companies born in the last century probably look like they're going to die in this century. And, it used to be that you'd have 75 years in the Fortune 500 if you were a major company. So that's a pretty decent amount of time to, spend in the Fortune 500. In 2020, it was only 15. And I don't even want to know what it will be now after COVID. So could it be 7? Could it be 5? Who knows, right? So number one immortal insight, the future is unevenly distributed. What do I mean by this? The other day, I was having a conversation with my dad. I love my dad. He's a dearly, dearly wonderful man. And he told me that he thinks that Banksy, the street artist, is going to be big. And so I just want to give you that insight there. I think that, if you don't know Banksy, my dad's told you that he's going to be big, right? So you can see the ridiculousness of this. But what this actually means is in the standard everything is standard distribution, right? Whether it's how much money does everybody make, how much does everybody know about this film, it always tends to level out as the standard distribution. Most people bunch up in the middle, and then you have the edges where people are either really bad or really good. And it's the same thing. When you apply that and put time across it, you end up with this. And this is how culture works. Ideas move from innovators to early adopters. Then they kind of jump this chasm, and they end up with an early majority who then bring that to a late majority. Then you get laggards, and then you get saboteurs. And then at the very end, you get my dad, who's 20 years too late, has figured out that street art is a thing. And this is what's amazing is you can be super innovative in one thing. So I would probably say, I know a fair bit about music, right? So if you want to talk to me about electronic music in particular, I'm probably on the innovation end of this curve, right? And that's what people say, edgy. I'm on the edge over there, right? But if you want to talk to me about sport, and I hate to say this, but my friends who talk about the IPL, I'm really embarrassed to tell you, I know nothing about it. So I'm probably right on the other side. I'm like a laggard. I'm like, what are the rules of cricket? Don't know, right? So this is how culture works. And this is where brands go wrong. Are you ready for this? There's a barrier to the mainstream. right? So every single idea that comes from innovators to early adopters, think about like crypto, right? Crypto started with innovators, then it moves to early adopters, then eventually it gets enough cultural momentum through network effects that it manages to get across into the early majority. And that's probably where it is now. All of us either are or know somebody who's into crypto, right? Every single thing jumps that chasm if it's going to make it into the mainstream. But here's where brands do the wrong thing. They think you can buy, using paid media, that middle of the curve. So every single brand strategy, every single brand brief I've ever seen in my life says, we need mass, we're Evian water or we're Coca-Cola and we need mass. And therefore we want to buy the middle of that curve with reach and frequency and efficient CPM to keep ideas salient at the top of mind and build distinct memory structures and keep refreshing them and keep refreshing them. And if we do that in the middle there with enough paid media, eventually people will say, this, we'll buy this, right? But here's the thing. That is not how culture works. It is not how culture works ever. It is literally trying to disobey the laws, the physical laws of culture. And the physical laws of culture are that everything starts with innovators, moves to early adopters through networks, spreading itself as it goes. If it gets to enough momentum, it crosses the chasm into the majority. But if it doesn't, it doesn't. And so constantly trying to put an idea into culture the wrong way, i.e. from the top, and disobeying the law of it's got to go from innovators to early adopters to early majority to be adopted. It's almost like trying to do a organ transplant by cutting out someone's heart while it's still beating, opening up someone else's body and just throwing it in and trying to sew it back up again. It doesn't work. You've not done all the connective work that would allow that heart to be part of the new organism to start pumping around that body. And so what we learned was you don't want to invest too early because this thing is essentially a wave, right? It starts off as innovators. And if you can see, if the bell starts ringing when innovators move to early adopters, that little red light starts flashing. This is happening. Something's moving through culture. It's got good momentum. We call it velocity growth rate, i.e. it's got enough velocity to jump that barrier and it's going to land in culture, whether that's body positivity or like Black Lives Matter or climate justice. We've been there every single time going, hey guys, this is coming. And every single boardroom's like, yeah, no, we need the middle bit. And so here's the first rule of innovation. Don't be too early because then you're just that guy at the conference talking about stuff 10 years too early. There's no money in that, right? But don't, whatever you do, make the mistake that all brands make, which is just buying reach and frequency in the middle of that graph, because that's how you look old, you look irrelevant, and you don't actually connect with culture. The way, if you're a major brand, to do it is to wait until the velocity growth rate of that idea, whether it's Black Lives Matter or it's climate justice, whatever, is just about to jump that bridge, that barrier. And just then, boom, that's when you release what you're supposed to do. Second one is focus on the internet. Every new day brings a new, type of thing. It's like, if you were crazy enough, you would pay attention to all these little, I guess they're kind of, gimmicks, really, they're tactics, and they're, it's like, this influencer's cool. No, she's not cool anymore. This influencer's cool. And what about VR? No, what about AR? No, it's not about that anymore. It's about NFTs. You will kill yourself trying to keep up with all of it. And there's no strategy to it. So let me give you sanity. Sanity comes from strategy, okay? And the strategy is focus on the internet. It sounds almost old school to talk about the internet now. Like, it's like my mum. My mum's like, oh, I was on the internet the other day, right? But actually, there's wisdom to this. Why do I say this? Because on the left-hand side, there's a 73-year-old male. On the right-hand side, there's a 73-year-old male. On the left-hand side, this person is high net worth individual, lives in Windsor, just outside of London, has 2 kids, and is 73 years old, right? On the right-hand side, we have somebody who's 73 years old, lives in Windsor outside of London in the UK, has 2 kids, and is a high net worth individual. Demographically, the Prince of Wales, Prince Charles, and the Prince of Darkness, Ozzy Osbourne, are exactly the same. And this is what passes as strategy in every boardroom I've ever sat in. Because everybody's looking for that middle, they define people demographically. So they say Mark Adams is a 36-year-old male living in London. It's like, yeah, that's kind of true, but it isn't what bonds me to anyone else. The internet itself doesn't think or talk or mention or isn't architected towards demographic segmentation. And yet brands have taken that idea from the 20th century and are trying to apply it in an architecture that doesn't reward that thinking. And here's the thing. We are infinitely more interesting, darker, stranger, more fascinating than the boardroom has ever given us credit for. And here is how we make good business sense out of that. We have to admit demographic segmentation ain't working. It's not working. I'm absolutely convinced that 90% of the brands that I speak to still rely on demographic segments more than any other. And that is the main reason why they're losing market share to brands that are coming out of nowhere. That's the main reason. So here's the thing. Our audience are telling us, don't address us by occupation, gender, sexual identity, economic status, age, ethnicity, and race. I'm not woke, right? I'm not like one of these Gen Z. I'm not old enough. I'm not young enough to be woke, right? I'm very old school in very many ways. Unfortunately, I'm way too old to be as woke as modern youth are now. But you know what they mean by woke? They're basically saying, stop defining us by the things that don't define us, i.e., define us the way we define ourselves. And that's by our hobbies and passions, our values, and our personality. And so when we started to do this, we started to realize, oh, wow, this is how the internet works. Because every single room is a cluster of community networks, right? And these networks have network effects. And this is, by the way, you go to Silicon Valley, all they talk about is network effects. And you go to Madison Avenue, or where people build brands, all they talk about is creative ideas and media. They've missed the trick. All the technologists in the planet are obsessed with network effects. I've never heard a brand person mention network effects in my life. Never heard an agency person mention network effects. And that's why brands and agencies are in trouble, right? Because they don't understand that you can build companies with network effects. And that's what the internet is. This is 3 definitions of the internet. What does it say? A network of interconnected networks, a network of networks, a network of interconnected networks. The internet, interconnected networks. So your job is to identify the networks that you wish to grow from and start to activate them to create network effects. Next thing, immortal insight number 3, community conquers all. What's amazing is when you think of another way of saying networks, there is community. When you have enough internal connectivity in a network, it gets to the point where it's beyond just a network, it's a community. So you see this so many times. Like in the UK, we have something called Mumsnet. Mumsnet isn't just a network, it's a community, because that network talks to each other enough that it's definable by, and you can use natural language processing, AI, to understand that. So remember I said to you, VGR meant velocity growth rate. Now I'm going to give you another one, POC, proof of community. If you can identify the networks that exist on the internet, and then you can find the ones where there's actually a community, that's interesting. I'm very lucky to be part of the journey of this brand called Gymshark. And this is my good friend, Noel Mack, talking about the reason that we've been growing is because we basically found gym goers who were constantly working out on their own, and we networked them together and then formed a community out of it. And now people feel like, you know, when they see that logo, it means that we're part of something. I promise you now, we have now moved from audience to network to community. That is the story of the internet. The story of the internet was aggregating audiences, and that's what media companies did. Then the smart media companies realized it's not really about audiences, it's about networks. And now the really smart companies are realizing it's not even about networks, it's about communities. There's so much money to be made in those three words and the distinction between them all. And look, all the biggest companies in the world, when they give us a brief, they always have a community at the core of the brief. They also have a secondary audience. We're going to talk about that, which is their broadcast audience. But they have a news audience, which is their community. Then they have a broadcast audience, which is their people they want in the middle of the curve we talked about, right? That's the mainstream. Everybody needs the mainstream. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying go niche, but I'm saying that you can build with a community so that what you do, the story you tell to the mainstream doesn't feel like it was built in a boardroom. It was built with a community. And all the smartest brands in the world are doing this. All the brands that are coming out of nowhere to billion-dollar valuations are doing this too. And this is the new way that brands are built. And every single major CPG and all your P&Gs and your Unilevers and they had a good time during the pandemic. Absolutely. They were absolutely up on the pandemic. But I promise you, the assault begins again now as people start to move out of that Maslow's bottom of the pyramid and start thinking about self-actualization again and who they really want to be. And they're going to start moving away from just, I want toilet roll, to I want toilet roll that does something, says something about me. Community members make a 4x contribution to gross margin. And I just want to talk about a company called Peloton, who I think are doing this better than anyone. They are absolutely nailing the idea that your community can do so much more for you than buy your product. Your broadcast audience, the best thing they can do for you is buy your product. But once they're in there, they can do so much more as a community member. They can share your content. They can give you reviews. They can sit around a dinner table and defend you when the time comes. This is powerful stuff. I urge you to consider it. The final thing I want to say is we're the first generation in human history to disband our tribes. I live far and far away from my mum and dad, where I grew up. But here's the thing, there's so much joy in that. And, we get to experience these lives that we wouldn't have got to live. But there's so much anxiety and depression caused by it as well, because we're sad and we don't know why. And that's because we've lost that community and we are desperate to find it again. And brands absolutely could be part of that answer if they were just willing to open their minds and think about it. Next one, final, kind of coming to the final bits now. Insight number 4, only create supply if there is demand. I mean, it's the first rule of economics, right? But it's immortal. And I can't tell you how many times a week I meet with a creative agency or a media agency or a brand, and all their whole plan is they're hell bent on creating something that there is zero demand for. And if you work in advertising, I'm just going to be honest with you now, your job that you've been doing for the past how many years you've mostly been creating supply where there is zero demand for it. The product there might be demand for, but the advertising that promotes the product, no one's waiting for that. No one is wanting that. It's just something we have to tolerate so that we can keep the internet free. And we're moving beyond that as well now. So here's the thing. We don't need this. I don't know if anyone saw the great work that Pepsi did around Black Lives Matter, where they absolutely face planted themselves using Kendall Jenner. And it was just a perfect example of creating something that added no value whatsoever to the world. And actually was so obviously self-serving that it became offensive and had to be pulled within 48 hours. So here's the thing. Once we start identifying these communities and these networks, if we want to, if we're so inclined, we can start to apply empathy. And we can start to actually think about this from a design point of view, because UX and UI and design is all about thinking with deep empathy. What does the user or the community member need? And so what's really interesting is there's this ability, if you think about how we can create supply that meets demand, you start thinking in a different way. You start thinking about communications that enhance, enable, engage, entertain, and can be experience-led. And, that's things like, all the greatest brands that these are my favorite brands, right? They're all doing things and considering me all the time in little ways. And that, might be Lego making 3 feature films. I'm like, oh, amazing. Yeah, I did have a demand for that. I didn't know I had, but there is. Uber having my playlist on Spotify as I join. I'm like, oh, you hit it right on the head. Thank you. Converse, in my world of, I love music, and Converse started to give away free studio space to aspiring musicians. It's absolutely brilliant. I would just say, look, it's an equity swap. Just think deeply what the community needs and what your brand or product has to give. And there's an immortal insight in the middle where you realize, oh my God, they need exactly what we have to give. Boom. Every great business is that. It's supply and demand. And it's the same for advertising and communications. If you can realize that people desperately need to hear or be told or be helped in the way that you can actually speak or help, by God, you've just reached a powerful insight. Final thing, storytelling. Only brands and agencies think that the story you tell is the same audience as the story is about. Do you see? The story is about the muse, but it's told and broadcast to everyone. And here's the thing. We have so badly lost it with the power of paid media. We've forgotten that storytelling can earn us media. Nobody found out about Game of Thrones because they saw an advert for Game of Thrones. They found out because everybody was like, you got to watch this. And we live now in this ultimately fractured environment. You can't buy enough eyeballs to cut through. It's just not possible. You have to start with advertising and then advertising. So as I said, find that community, advertise with them, build a story together. Then that story has to be powerful enough with enough insights that you can broadcast it, and that becomes your advertising. But don't get confused between the two audiences. And here's the thing, if you just try and broadcast, it's really hard, because then you're getting out the paid media, you're trying to win, you're trying to tell a story that's basically cooked up in the boardroom. It's never going to work. This is where we have an insane amount of power to change people's minds, and we've forgotten about this power. We're ignoring it. And Madison Avenue and then the advertising industry really needs to learn from Silicon Valley about network effects, but also from Hollywood about the power of stories and how you take an insight that seems niche and you scale it so that it's relevant to everyone.
With that, it's a wrap on this episode of Melt. You can follow us on social media. Our handle is Ready to Melt. And stay updated with all that's happening in the world of advertising and marketing with our daily Melt update on our website, readytomelt.com. I shall see you next week, same time, same place. Goodbye.